This video is part of the professional learning support for the Good Teaching Planning for Learning booklet, and in particular it focuses on planning lessons. Planning is an important part of the work of all teachers, and this is recognised in the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. In particular, Standard 3, Plan for and Implement Effective Teaching and Learning. Let's take a look at this in a little more detail. Part of the professional practice of all teachers is planning for and implementing effective teaching and learning. This involves a number of focus areas: establishing challenging learning goals, planning, structuring and sequencing learning programs, using teaching strategies, selecting and using resources, using effective classroom communication, evaluate and improve teaching programs, and engage parents and carers in the educative process. There are many implications here for planning at the individual lesson level. For example, the importance of setting learning goals and being explicit with students about what the goals are for the learning. Planning and structuring the learning program so that lessons flow on from each other and connect and are not a series of unconnected experiences. Using teaching strategies. This involves being clear about the strategies that we'll use and planning for them before the lesson is taught. Selecting and using resources. Which resources, including ICT, might be used in a particular lesson? Use of effective classroom communication. What are the strategies that the teacher will use in order to ask questions and engage in communication with the students? And how will the lesson be evaluated to improve the teaching program? What can I learn from this lesson about my teaching, but also about student learning that helps me plan the next learning? So there is a lot to be gained by looking at the professional standards and exploring how teachers move from the graduate through to lead level in their understanding and implementation of this element of professional practice. When thinking about lesson level planning, we start with what we know about our students and where they're at in their learning. Asking ourselves questions such as, what do I know about what my students already know? What does the formative assessment data tell me about where they're at in their learning? Which students do I know who are likely to be holding misconceptions about the concepts within the unit that I'm about to do and the lesson that I'm about to teach? Who are the students who are going to require adjustments of curriculum in order to enable them to access and extend their learning within this lesson? What are the students interested in and how might I use that as a hook to engage them in the lesson? And what learning experiences have they already had which connect to this lesson? Secondly, understanding the content of the curriculum for the appropriate year level and knowing how that learning progresses over the years of schooling is really important in considering what's going to be taught within the lesson. Let's take a look at how we access and use the scope and sequence. We click on the Australian Curriculum homepage, and in this case we'll look at mathematics. So we go to mathematics, click on organisation, and here we see scope and sequence. If we scroll down on the scope and sequence, we see how particular ideas in mathematics develop. Let's, for example, look at fractions and decimals, how they develop from year 1 through to year 6, and of course into further years as we move down the document. This helps us be clear about when particular topics start to be taught and where we place particular emphasis in the curriculum. So for example, if I'm teaching year 5, I can see that one of the things I need to be teaching is to help students compare and order common unit fractions and locate and represent them on a number line. This helps me think about unit planning, but also down at the lesson level. It also helps to see the full development of ideas across the scope and sequence so that I can look both back at the previous years and up at the years ahead, so that if I'm considering differentiation, I can plan for particular experiences, perhaps in years below, that enable some students to gain necessary understandings to help them progress towards the appropriate year level understandings. Next consideration is the explicit teaching focus. What are the deliberate acts that I as a teacher are going to plan for in this lesson? Really well crafted lessons may look as if there's been no planning done at all, but in most cases the deliberate planning has been done around the types of teaching strategies that are going to be used and why. Here we're thinking about things such as, how will the students know what the learning intentions are? What will they be learning and why? And how will they know if they've been successful? How might we use, for example, pieces of student work from another class to show what good quality work looks like and what they should be striving for? What tasks will be selected? For example, do the tasks match with the curriculum? Is there a line of sight back to the achievement standard? Do the tasks enable all students to access them? Are they open enough to allow all students to make a start with the task and engage with it? Some people describe such tasks as having high ceilings and low floors. How might the task be assessed, and how will students be aware of what they're going to be assessed on? What learning strategies and vocabulary will I as a teacher model, and how will students know what they're expected to respond with? How will questions be used to both challenge and support the thinking of all students? How will questions be both enabling prompts or extending prompts to ensure that I can differentiate the learning from different students in my class? And how will the lesson be structured? What will happen at the beginning of the lesson, in the middle phase of the lesson, and in the conclusion of the lesson? Another consideration is around differentiation. When we've used formative assessment, we find out where students are at in their learning. And this helps us understand that students are at very different points in their understanding. And therefore we need to consider strategies for differentiation to enable all students to access the curriculum at their appropriate year level in appropriate ways. This involves asking questions such as, who are the students who are going to require extending prompts to challenge them to go beyond? Who are the students who may require adjustments to enable them to access the learning tasks? How might the numeracy or literacy continua and student diversity advice from the Australian curriculum be used to make adjustments for students with an IEP? And how might extension be provided for students who have a PLP? Let's take a look at the Australian curriculum advice on making adjustments. Here we see on the home page the tab Student Diversity. When we click on this tab, it helps us see that we've got an introduction around how we meet diverse learning needs within the Australian curriculum, and then some tabs along the top. Advice for students with disability, gifted and talented students, and students for whom English is an additional language or dialect. On this tab, we're able to click and see some video illustrations of personalised learning where teachers have used the year level appropriate Australian curriculum and then made adjustments to allow particular students to access the curriculum using various differentiation strategies. In order to access more information around differentiation, you may wish to look at the Good Teaching Differentiated Classroom Practice booklet from the Department of Education. Here we see an example of the phases of the lesson. As mentioned earlier, it's important to consider the structure of the lesson, the introduction, the phase of explicit teaching and guided student action, and the review phase. Some guiding questions around the introduction may be, how will I hook the students into this lesson? This might involve things such as a game, a video clip, a piece of literature, some type of hook that engages and links in with student interests. Being clear about the learning intentions, being clear about the success criteria, and how we'll activate prior knowledge to link this lesson to prior learning. This ensures that lessons within a unit are not simply a whole series of one-offs, but actually connected one to the other. In the explicit teaching phase, it's important that we as teachers think about what actions we're going to take, how we're going to ask questions, how we'll encourage student conversation and thinking, how we'll check for understanding and what we'll do if some students are demonstrating that they don't understand, how we'll provide for extension with some students, and which students will require additional support and how it's going to be provided. And also the importance about providing feedback at this stage. When students, for example, are working on a problem-solving task in mathematics, how might we provide feedback to them about the strategies they're using, or help them move on to higher order thinking in some instances? In the review phase, we're thinking about how we might encourage students to reflect on their learning, the formative assessment data that we might gather, and the strategies that we'll use to support formative assessment. And most importantly, we'll be thinking at this stage, how might the information that I've collected and the data that I now have as a result of this lesson help me think about the next step in my planning? What will the next step involve as a result of what I've learnt from this lesson? Here we see a blank lesson plan pro forma. We see that it's got space for an introduction, the explicit teaching, the student action, and the review. On the right-hand side, we see a column for adjustments. This is where we'll be writing in opportunities and strategies to differentiate the experiences and make adjustments so that all students can experience the curriculum at the appropriate level. Here's a completed lesson plan. This is for Year 5, fractions on a number line. For more information about this, you may wish to look at the Good Teaching Planning for Learning booklet and look at the plan in more detail. We see that there's an introduction with a game, there's a sharing of the learning intentions, an activation of prior knowledge, and an adjustment made with some students using whole numbers as opposed to the fractions that are used by other students in the class. In the explicit teaching phase, the teacher's using fraction cards and a rope and pegs to demonstrate how we order and compare fractions on a number line. In the next phase of the lesson, in the student action phase where students are working on a task, some students are given extending prompts where they're asked to place fractions, more complex fractions, on the number line and to go beyond where the rest of the class are expected to be. Whilst for one student, adjustments are made using the Australian Curriculum Numeracy Continua Level 1A, where they're still working on the idea of fractions, but what they're doing as part of their IEP is recognising 1/2 and cutting and folding materials to look at the idea of 2 equal parts. In the review phase, the students come back together to share their thinking and their learning, and the teacher uses a formative assessment task to find out where the students are in their understanding. Now considering the differentiation, we see that some students have been provided with extending prompts, some students are provided with enabling prompts, and one student has curriculum adjustments using the numeracy continua. In this final slide, we consider the question of common lesson structures and their benefits across the whole school. Common lesson structures across the school can support classroom observations and collaborative planning for teachers, as they provide a common language to discuss and provide feedback on teaching strategies. For example, if we are all using the terminology review phase, we can provide each other with feedback about what the review phase looked like and how we might improve next time. When schools adopt common lesson structures, students know what the expectations are. They know the routine of what's going to happen. There's going to be an introduction, there's going to be a time of explicit instruction, and there's going to be a time when the lesson is drawn to a close. And finally, a question: how might common lesson structures be used in your school context to support both student and teaching learning?